Hey, Martin.
Interesting image you're using as your background
Yeah,
thing.
that's an investigative story I'm very proud of. I was able to
In the
get the
Village
boys,
Voice.
yeah, I was able to get them to write a hard-hitting expose on energy service companies and how they rip people
Oh,
off. I have a bunch of stuff like that. I rotate through it. Usually I just put them up to help the people that I'm talking with concentrate on the fact that I'm going to do something horrible to them.
okay.
Hey, counsel. Uh, so I was watching just up until a minute ago the state legislature because they are in the process of getting ready to debate a bill that will impose a mandatory moratorium on all utilities in the state of New York until a period after the end of the public health crisis or the expiration of the state of emergency.
Do you mean a moratorium on rate hikes?
A moratorium on shutoffs, not on rate hikes. Yeah, I'm working on the rate hikes through another avenue. But as you know, the moratorium that exists now is voluntary. And so, there's no penalty for breaking the moratorium. And there are a couple of million people that need it. So
that's pretty positive.
yeah, I'm very happy. It passed overwhelmingly in the Senate. It was 58-4, which means that 18 Republicans out of 23 voted for it.
That's
which
awesome.
ain't bad. Yeah.
Wow.
In the Assembly, I think it's going to be about 130-20, but we'll see after they do the math, after they do all the voting. So when I'm done with this tonight, I'll be writing my press release.
Yay.
Yeah. Here, let me do a face. There you go.
Hi.
Hi. Let's see. Well, we don't have a, let's see, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, we don't have to act under a public hearing tonight, so we don't need a quorum, although it's always nice to have one. How you doing? And you can go Adriana first and then Martin and then Louis.
I'm assuming you're talking to somebody else.
Well, we care about you too.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, good. Loving working from home, and it sounds like I may keep working from home for a little longer, so excited about that.
Yeah, the state's not sure, I think.
Yeah, well, what I've been hearing is that it sounds like people who aren't able to fully work from home.
I don't have you in the Brady Bunch. I am so sorry, Serena and Denard. I call that the Brady Bunch setup, but I have you in the little strip across the top. And
I was about to say, I've been sitting here for a while now.
Geez, I feel like such a jerk. Nice one. And Denard is sitting there quietly, and he's going to get me later.
Denard, you're muted.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you.
I think your Zoom is muted.
There we go.
Oh, there you go.
I was listening to the wonderful conversation about the hydro thing that you guys were talking about. I was like, okay, yeah, this.
Yeah, well, we've all got Zoom fatigue. So let me open up the Board of Zoning Appeals public meeting for Wednesday, May 27th. And let's see, I wanted to start off by making a couple of statements very briefly. The first one is that an agenda came out that called itself the Public Meeting and Hearing Agenda. We're not going to have a public hearing, so that portion of the agenda is inaccurate. But also it reads as if the 36 Judson Street case was on an active agenda for tonight. It's actually still on the pending agenda. There's no action that's going to take place on that. So if anyone joined the call or is busily importuning the mayor's office or the planning department for questions on what we're going to do on that tonight, the answer quite simply is nothing. And so our only active agenda issue tonight is a discussion of the draft ethics policy that council sent around to everybody. So I just wanted to clear that up before we got going in case anybody was tuning in here as opposed to watching what's going on over at the state legislature or, you know, some stock car races or something. So any of you folks have any questions or no? Okay. Let me switch you to Brady Bunch view. Yeah, now I see everybody. Cool. All right, Amy, do you want to add anything to that about the agenda and the Judson case, or you want to just start the presentation on the draft ethics policy?
I think you got it all.
Okay.
Louise, do you want to bring up the draft policy that I sent around?
I'll bring it up now.
And I do apologize for sending it out so late in the afternoon today. It's okay if you didn't get a chance to look over it. It's pretty short, so we can go over it quickly here tonight. So the way that I see this is, you know, I drafted it with the intention of hoping that it would be helpful to the board members in terms of figuring out when they have a conflict of interest and then trying to provide some guidelines in terms of what you do when you have a conflict of interest. So the first paragraph there basically it provides a definition for a conflict of interest. It's pretty broad and expansive, including perceived conflicts of interest as well as real conflicts of interest where there are specific financial or familial ties. It's substantially broader, I think, than the definition of conflicts under the state law, which is phrased, the way the state law puts it is rather awkward. They talk about whether you have a contract with another party, but contract is defined very broadly to include a relationship, basically. So I think that this covers, I think, more things. It's a little bit easier to understand. I do understand, however, that it's pretty vague and it's not always easy to figure out whether some relationship that you might have might be a conflict of interest or not. So, you know, the idea is that if you're not sure, you know, you can then take a look at the conflict of interest policy and consult with corporation counsel and get a decision about that. Second paragraph, ethical conduct, just says that board members and employees will conduct themselves ethically. The disclosure paragraph in number 3 just says that board members and employees will inform corporation counsel when they have an actual or perceived conflict of interest. And then in the 4th paragraph, corporation counsel then has to advise board members and employees whether it's a conflict and then how they should proceed. The recusal and abstention paragraph basically just provides that if there is an actual or perceived conflict, the board members shouldn't participate in any, you know, vote or discussion regarding that issue. It's a little bit broader than, you know, what's required, I think, under state law in terms of when people have to recuse or abstain. But again, you know, I think that we want to be more ethical than not in terms of dealing with these conflicts. Number 6, the records of conflicts of interest. So this just says that, you know, whenever a board member discloses a conflict, it'll be reflected in the minutes. Violations in number 7, I hope that this wouldn't come up very often, but if a board member or employee is aware of another board member or employee having a conflict that they're not disclosing, then they're supposed to, you know, tell on them to corporation counsel. And then the last part is the acknowledgement, which is just, you know, it's a formality for board members to state that they've read it and, you know, and they're going to comply with the policy. So that's it. It's pretty short.
Okay, thank you, counsel. Let me ask the members of the board, do you all have, and again, sorry you got it so late, it was partly my fault because I was watching the shenanigans over at the state legislature instead of giving a final go-ahead to Amy. So my apologies. But do you all have any questions? And before you ask any questions, let me suggest, by the way, that the state employees, particularly the two state attorneys who are on the board, should bring this back to your general counsel, let them take a look at it, and have them give you an opinion as to whether it creates any conflicts for you with any duties that you owe to your agency. And if so, to propose some language that we can work on with city's corporation counsel to make sure that it's possible for state attorneys to be able to serve on the board.
I'm not aware of any attorney general opinions that specifically address that, but I mean, I don't think that it would be per se, prohibited for a state attorney to also be on a board.
When I joined, I filled out the disclosure forms, and it went through the process and was approved. I think it was approved with a caveat that I had to sign off on that I would recuse myself of anything that OTDA would either be involved with or fund, even indirectly.
Yeah.
Right, and well, I'm not an attorney, but I did the same thing for DOH, so I had to go through J-Code.
And me too. I went through the full review examination process, got a whole opinion and everything. So we went through multiple steps to get approval from OCFS.
Yeah, I was the person that wrote those approvals once upon a time when I worked at OCFS. So I can appreciate your pain. And
Yes.
Denard was the one who told me I didn't do a good job on it back then. But yeah, I would just suggest that you might want to take it back, because while your counsel's offices might have thought about this, there's no reason to keep them in the dark about this. And particularly since this is not 100% consistent with either the public officers law or, well, yeah, I guess the public officers law is what matters to you guys. I don't think that they'll say anything, but councils are always happy when they know everything.
The public officers law, it does have various ethics requirements that do apply to zoning board members, absolutely. But as I said, I think this is more ethical than what's set out in the state law, and I don't see any reason why they can't coexist with each other.
So I guess for me, I have a few questions, and I've been beat over the head with the ethics law. So these are silly questions, but they're points of confusion. And then, like, the last training that I went to, we actually went to the training on conflict of interest and ethics. And so it was just a few questions. So, like, in the first subparagraph 1 with conflict of interest, it says that, let's see, board member or employer, member of the family entity in which they have some financial or personal interest. Can you just expound a little bit upon what personal interest refers to? So, like, if a friend of mine's wife came before the board, would that be considered a personal interest? I mean, like, could you break that down for me a little bit?
The conflicts of interest are inherently impossible, I think, to define completely.
Mm-hmm.
There are always going to be new situations that come up that have to be figured out. I think your example of, like, a friend of yours or a friend of or your friend's significant other, if they come before the board, I think in some cases that could be a conflict of interest. It depends on how close your relationship with the friend is and or the significant other, and also what you might know of their situation ahead of time versus having no clue whatsoever about it. It's not going to be a conflict of interest, because you know of somebody or they're an acquaintance and they come before the board. But if they're, your best friend or, a very close person to you, I think it could be a conflict, or at least lead to conflict.
Okay. All right, and so like, if an instance like that came up, then the appropriate thing to do will be to report it to the chair and to the corporate counsel and say, this is a concern that I have.
Absolutely. I mean, if you have a concern about whether or not something is a conflict, come to corporation counsel or to, or to the chairman. In a case like that, I'm not sure how helpful I would be able to be, except to say, this is kind of, you need to judge whether or not you know this person too well and have much of an affinity for them to, to make an unbiased and impartial decision.
Okay. And so then my second question or point of confusion with all of this is with recusal and abstention. So, if there is something that comes before the board and I believe that I should recuse myself from it, as a citizen of the city, am I able to participate in the discussion of the topic? So I recuse myself as a board member. I can't sit in the audience and have an opinion. I have to just completely leave the room or not attend the meeting for that particular issue.
Yeah, you may remember, and forgive me, I'll jump in for a sec, Amy. You may remember that from time to time, there have been issues where I had a conflict and I recused myself. And not only did I leave the room and not take part in the discussion, I actually went out around the corner so you couldn't see me nodding or waving or smiling from from the hallway. And there are some cases in Westchester where all the good zoning conflict of interest cases come from, apparently, that are about members of the town zoning board or planning board sitting in the audience and, essentially directing the action of the board from sitting in the front row and waving their fingers and that kind of thing. And so that's a big no-no.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, my guidance is generally, that even though there is a distinction between abstention and recusal under the law, and I think there are various situations where cases say that you don't need to fully recuse yourself. It's generally better to just leave the room and not be involved whatsoever. So I mean, that would be my advice in pretty much every situation. Mm-hmm. Unless there's some pressing need that you feel that you have to be in the room while it's happening and or make a comment as a member of the public. I can't imagine that there would be a lot of situations where that would come up, and it's better practice just to fully remove yourself from the proceedings.
And remember that in the case of an abstention, it may be that for whatever reason, you do not believe that you can be objective on a case coming before the zoning board. You may have no personal connection to it at all, but for whatever reason, you don't believe that you can approach the issue without having prejudged it. And that's a reasonable reason for an abstention.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Absolutely. I would also just, on the point of recusal, I would also say that, because of the legal issue involved, because courts have in various cases said, there was a conflict of interest and, this person didn't recuse themselves, they sat in the audience or they sat at the table, they rolled their eyes at certain points, or, even if they didn't roll their eyes, that can be a basis for invalidating whatever action's taken. And so, it's really about making sure at that point that the decision of the BZA is valid.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions from the board?
I have a question about point 4 of the policy. So is that intending to mean, so what would happen if we disclose a potential conflict of interest, corp counsel reviews it and determines there's no actual conflict, but I guess the board member still believes there's,
So
like that's where the abstention would come in potentially, I guess. Because it seems like the decision of whether or not there's a conflict lies with Corp Counsel, which I don't know. Yes.
No, I think that's a good point. And, you know, while I think it's helpful for Corp Counsel to, you know, be able to provide an opinion, if a board member thinks there's a conflict and Corp Counsel disagrees and wants the board member to stay quiet and not say anything, then I would hope that the board member would go ahead and state on the record, you know, the issue themselves and recuse. But that's an interesting point. I'm making a note that I should consider adding something.
Maybe
Yeah, I mean, I read it as will advise.
Yeah, maybe it's just changing that bolded sentence so that it's not determine.
Got
that.
it.
Yeah, maybe.
We changed it around a little earlier today, so.
Yeah, if your concern, Adriana, is that the Corp Counsel would tell you not to take a seat on the dais and not to act as an independent body, absent a conflict, that would be a no. But again, they can tell you, yes, it is a conflict as I read the law. And then, you know, you have a duty as a board member to recuse yourself if there's an actual conflict of interest. And I'll make a note. Hey, Luis, do you mind taking a note that we should invite the Department of State to come back and run the ethics training for the land use boards again sometime between now and the end of the year? Because I like that lady. It wasn't Linda. It wasn't the general counsel at Department of State, but it was someone that worked in the litigation division and local governments. Chris Eastman will know who it was. I got notes somewhere, but it's years ago.
I might be able to ask Patty Salkin to come in.
That'd be fun too. I have a few unfinished arguments with her. That would be great.
Her ethics talks are great. I'll ask. She's always very busy, but she might have some time for us.
Well, the advantage of doing it via Zoom is that they don't have to make the trip to Albany if we want to do an in-person training.
This is true.
More attractive than ever to people to provide the trainings.
I have a second question, just sorry. Is there any like major obvious differences that we would potentially point out to our general counsels with like the public officers law? Or like, I feel like if I just share this with my supervisors, they're gonna be like, they're gonna want points. So I don't know if you already, I mean, I can review it and like, yeah, craft an email to go with it. But if you're aware of like a couple major areas where there's like distinction.
The definition of a conflict of interest is very different under the public officers law. I want to say it's section 84.
Yeah, sounds right.
The definition of a conflict is very different. That's probably the biggest thing, but it's also been, you know, a week or two since I looked at the general municipal law.
Okay. Was there already some of this as part of like, doesn't the city BZA, don't we have like, there's bylaws, right? Like in the bylaws, there was nothing about conflict of interest. It was just a thought as I'm thinking through.
I have the BZA rules of procedure, I think they're called.
Yep.
And I did look at them before I worked on this. I don't remember if there's a specific recusal extension disclosure type provision, but if there is, it's not very, you know, it's not very specific.
Okay.
Yeah, when I wrote those, my intent was just
it's
to
a sentence, or you know.
It was just to rationalize our procedural rules. They had been written by Jeff Jameson, who ended up with a work product that I thought we should update.
Okay. Thank you.
Are there other questions? So I did want to mention that, so you guys are the first board that I've brought this to as an actual draft with like drafted language. I have talked with the planning board, and I talked with the chairman of Historic Resources Commission, and generally, you know, all of the boards I think are in support of adopting this kind of language for themselves. I think that we're probably going to have each of the boards adopt their own set of, you know, however you want to call it, the policy or the conflict of interest or ethical rules. So you guys are somewhat of a leader, I guess, among the land use boards in the city. I think it would certainly be reasonable. You know, we don't have to adopt these right away. We can think about them. We can see what Planning Board and Historic Resources Commission think are important things to, you know, to add or take out of this type of policy. Along that line of thinking, I did want to mention, as far as I'm aware, the only other board in the city that has this type of policy is the Water Board. And it has a document that it calls its Code of Ethics. A lot of it is similar to the conflicts of interest policy here, just, you know, laid out slightly differently. They also have a set of various, what they call ethical standards. And I'm not sure if this is something that the BZA wants to adopt, or, you know, I'm not sure that it's something that would necessarily have to be in the same document as the conflicts of interest. It could be somewhat separate. But I just kind of wanted to throw that out, that there are other sort of related issues that you might want to think about. So one of those that the planning board mentioned recently was ex parte discussions. You know, so when you run into an applicant on the street and you start, you know, just talking, and all of a sudden they disclose all of this stuff that they didn't tell to the board. You know, what do you do at that point? Or if you run into them on the street, are you allowed to, you know, ask them how their kids are doing? So that's an issue that does come up sometimes. Some of the things on the water board list, I thought I would just mention as examples of this type of stuff. No water board member or employee should attempt to use his or her official position to secure unwarranted privileges or exemptions for himself or others. They shall not, by their conduct, give a reasonable basis for the impression that any person can improperly influence them. They
may also be covered under the Public Authorities Accountability Act because they function as an authority.
Well,
so
that's
some of those requirements may come down from.
I did copy most of this conflicts of interest policy from the ABO, so I'm not surprised that they actually have ethical standards set up. I'm just looking.
Yeah, they have a more of a fiduciary responsibility than we do.
Water board people should endeavor to pursue a course of conduct which will not raise suspicion among the public that they're likely to be engaged in acts that are in violation of the public trust. These are very broad, you know, I'm not sure where these came from.
It came from the Public Officers Law.
Did they?
Yeah.
I don't remember.
That's in section 73 or 74. I always get those two confused, but there's a bunch of 19th century language that's, you should not act in such a way as to cause anyone to have any belief that you might be corrupt. They
mentioned gifts in here, you know.
Yeah.
That, board members shouldn't receive gifts. They do also, they also have a section saying that their code shall not supersede any more stringent requirement in the state law, which is probably a good thing to add in just in case.
The supremacy clause.
Well, it's a preemption, non-preemption clause. Use of city property for non-official purposes. I think those are those are some of the more interesting ones that I thought I would just mention. So if if you want to keep discussing this and you want to keep thinking about these other sort of related ethical issues, I don't really have any preconceived notion as to how you guys might want to address them.
So
Or
this is what
even
I'd
if
like
they
to
need
do,
to be.
and I'm happy to call for a discussion. I don't want to take any action on this conflict policy because you all didn't get a chance to really look at it for any period of time. So I'd like you to have a chance to take it home. If you want to do edits on it, to do edits and send them to council, and come prepared to discuss it again at a future workshop meeting. That's step one. Step two, if you could give us the ethical standards from the water board, those would be worth looking at. And while I understand that that Al and possibly HRC might want to have something different, I think we should try as much as possible to have the conflict of interest policy be uniform across the land use boards, even though we don't approach the issues under the same piece of law and we have different outcomes. We have the same duty to bring impartial judgment and the best interest of the city to our consideration of land use issues. So we should be, if possible, on the same, literally on the same page with regard to conflict policy.
I think it's a very good point that you make, and regardless of it being exactly identical, I do think that we should wait and see what type of discussion the board members from HRC and the planning board raised, because they might have thought of things that you guys haven't.
Yep.
It also seems cleaner if the same policy covers everybody. It's weird when different boards have different policies, even though they're kind of functioning in a very similar capacity. So
I mean, we have talked about this among the staff and whether or not it would be better to just adopt one policy that applies, throughout the planning department.
Yep.
I think that's still a possibility, but I tend to think that it's somewhat more of a statement for each of the boards to go forward with adopting their own, rather than deciding to have these ethical standards as opposed to having them just handed down. That's just my opinion.
Well, yeah, and honestly, no one could hand them down because we're not subject to, except for the council, we're not subject to the jurisdiction of the corporation counsel's office, or for that matter, the planning department. So I would think, as a practical matter, it would make sense to, I haven't had a 3 chairs lunch. I started this thing when I took this job where I would go out to lunch once a quarter with the other land use board chairs. We haven't done it for a while because we did a couple of years, and then we used to take out all the planning board staff at the end of, for the holidays. And we haven't done that for a bit because I think we felt that most of the perceived problems had gone away by then. But I'll reach out to the other 2 the land use board chairs, and we'll talk about this. So that's the first thing, because I think if we intend to do this as a statement of an interest in ethics, then we should have a joint meeting of the 3 boards and adopt it at the same time if we can, because that would send a very strong message. Having said that, something that just popped into my mind is that if you read this, it purports to bind employees of the planning department.
It does.
But we can't do that.
That's a good point. Again, this was mostly drawn from the ABO's model language. So that is a good point.
Yeah, so we should look at that and think about that and make sure that we're not exceeding our jurisdiction, which normally I'm happy to do, as you well know, counsel. But I think this is one of those cases where we probably shouldn't. What do you think, board members? You guys have any? So again, I don't want to do anything with it now. I want us to be able to take it home and look at it and think about it. You state employees, if you want to take it back to your general counsel, go for it. I mean, I'm my general counsel at work, so I'm going to put my general counsel hat on and tell me what I should be thinking at some point. or I'll go to my deputy and ask her. But I think we should assume that we'll be able to have another conversation about this next month, and that I'll try and meet with the two land use board chairs, and you should too, Amy, I mean, and talk to them. And I'll see why they think that there shouldn't be one unified policy, because that seems to be easier all around.
You know, it's been an ongoing conversation, and I think it makes sense to continue that conversation. You know, there's certainly there's no pressing need to, you know, to adopt this. It's more of a, you know, of a housekeeping type thing that, you know, we think it's a good idea to have this. And so I think it's valuable to keep talking about it and, you know, settle on the best way to do it.
Okay. Board members, you guys have any thoughts? Think expansively when we next come back to talk about this, which may be as early as next month or may take longer depending on what the other boards have in mind. I'd like it if we could move towards some kind of unified code of ethics. I'm not sure whether it's a conflict policy, I mean, an ethics policy, since the city of Albany doesn't have one. I guess it would make all of us feel a little bit better. But you know, that's not the driving interest. And there may be a ethics policy for the city of Albany at some point.
I did hear that I believe Richard Conti has introduced an ethics policy again, or might at some point soon. I can't say that for sure, but you know, I think again, I think that this can coexist with a broader ethics policy that's enacted by the city. It can always be revisited in the future as well. But I do think that, you know, this could be a good way just to, you know, to have the discussion, you know, while we don't have any citywide ethics policies.
Yeah. Okay.
I just wanted to make a quick announcement. Councilperson Jahmel Robinson has entered the webinar a few minutes ago.
Hi, council member. Do you want to ask him if he wants to speak, even though we're not doing anything with the convenience store case? I mean, we're always happy to have him come visit with us.
While we're waiting for his answer, I was just going to say that I would be very curious to see if Mr. Conti does come with a City of Albany-wide ethics policy. I would be very interested in seeing it, just because Albany is small Albany, right? And it's like 2 to 3 degrees of separation. So just how does that play into the considerations here?
I can send you, I have a previous version that was introduced and not adopted. I believe it's not the only previous version, but I can certainly email that out to you guys too. I have it right in front of me.
Okay, that'll be good. Thank you.
Yeah, he did a really good job on it, honestly.
It's very extensive.
Yeah, there was a conference at Fordham University like 15 or 20 years ago, and he took away materials from that, and they also did a summary of all the ethics policies and the ethics laws in New York and other states. And so Rich's draft legislation was really quite good, but unfortunately probably impossible to pass under Jerry Jennings, and you know, he hasn't focused on it since then. Oh, it looks like the council member is going to go back to something else.
I'm sending that out to you guys now. I just sent the Albany Water Board Code of Ethics too.
Thank you. So now, under the conflict of interest policy, if the council member invited us to one of his barbecues, which Facebook seems to think are quite good, I'm just kidding. Anyway, bless you, Serena.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone got anything else? Luis, you have anything else too?
No.
Okay. In that case, I don't see any reason not to close the meeting. And do we have any cases yet for what would be the next workshop, Luis?
So there are a couple of cases that are now approved and will be going on to the workshop for next month. We have another sign case for the 161 Washington Avenue extension. And there is, off the top of my head, there's about 2 more, but I'm getting ready to set up the agenda and put up all the case files online and send them over to you all pretty shortly.
By the way, I was wondering what happened to that case, that sign case for, what was it? The shoe store?
Yeah, the
Skechers.
Yeah, so the applicant was able to apply for the on-premises special sign program, so that ended up having them not need a variance anymore because they took the signage they got from the other frontage and they just kind of rearranged it so that they got the appropriate sign for the frontage they wanted, and just while reducing the size of the sign on the other side of the frontage.
Okay, great.
Good, good. Okay. And Amy, do we have any anticipation that the Judson Street case may actually pop up at not at our next workshop, but at our next public hearing next month?
I would like for it to be resolved, but I can't necessarily make any accurate predictions or say anything to that effect.
Okay. Then for the time being, we'll hold that case in abeyance until city and applicant are able to come to some kind of a meeting of the minds on whether they want us to render a final opinion or whether there's able to be some kind of a settlement. Cool. Do we have any litigation updates or potential litigation updates for the board members, Amy?
I am not sure when I last talked to you about the lawsuit involving the blood plasma center determination. Due to the timing, it was filed at the beginning of March, and before I was able to submit a response for the BZA, the governor shut down the courts. And that executive order has since been extended a few times. And the result is basically that I still haven't submitted a response. As of now, it will be submitted on the 8th, I believe is the date. And so I will have more updates at that point. But it's somewhat just in limbo, waiting for the courts to open.
I forgot if I sent you, the Chief Justice sent out a policy update on the reopening of the courts for non-essential matters, of which this is one, obviously. There's no life or death or criminal justice aspect to it.
Well, I'm going on the instructions of the actual judge in this case.
Good. Okay.
So, I think I'll listen to those. I mean, it's certainly possible that it might be adjourned again. I wouldn't be that surprised, I guess, at this point, but I would also like to, to move on with the litigation and hopefully get a decision. I think the extension so far has been 87 days of the court tolling, by the way. I was reading up on what the tolling does to various time periods.
Okay, so I think we're in good shape then. Board members, any questions, comments, or should we just all wave bye-bye and in the hopes that someday there'll be a vaccine and we'll be able to meet in person again? Okay, well, thank you all as always. I greatly appreciate your dedication to the interests of the city of Albany. And I don't know if you've been doing it recently, but if you walk around the city, you can see writ visibly upon the city, the changes that have occurred because of the work that you've been doing and we've been doing as a board. And I always find that to be a very positive thing to look around and say, look at this, terrific new building, or look at these changes in this area, et cetera, et cetera. So thank you all, and stay healthy, okay?
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone.